In this video, we'll be discussing whether or not All Quiet on the Western Front deserves to be called the outstanding picture of the year that it came out. Or half year and half year. Which is still a full year, I guess, so, no need to be pedantic. This was actually a bit of a harder video to make and scratch up movies for. Don't get me wrong, there are some great films that came out in 1929 and 1930, but the problem is that they were all in the first half of 1929 or the second half of 1930. In other words, outside of the time brackets for this Academy Awards ceremony. But still, I guess there were a few movies that were worth talking about in this time period. One of them was Tom Sawyer, which was the big box office hit of 1930, grossing over $11 million, and this was back in 1930, so you can round that out for inflation for today. Based on the classic novel by Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer is about a boy whose name you'll never guess, played by Jackie Coogan, who lives in a town on the Mississippi River with his Aunt Polly, played by Clara Blandick, and tells of all the misadventures he gets into with his best friend, Huckleberry Finn, played by Junior Durkin. Now let me say I was dreading this film when I was about to watch it. Why, you may ask? Well, if you've seen enough movies in your life, then you'll probably know that one of the unspoken rules is that child actors can run the gamut from really, really good to really, really awful and annoying. There is very rarely an in-between. And the further back in time you go through Hollywood, the more likely they'll fall into the awful category due to the lower standards of casting calls. I bring this up because the acting in this movie is surprisingly really good across the board. Again, this is good by 1930 standards, but even by those standards, I was expecting these kids to grate my nerves. Instead, they're all incredibly likable, have their own unique personalities, and can be very charming. Tom Sawyer is a lovable trickster, Huckleberry Finn is a little dim-witted, but always eager to have fun. I especially love Tom's cousin Sid, played by Jackie Searle. This kid is such a brat and is always looking to get Tom in trouble, but he pushes it just far enough that it still remains fun. As for the rest of the movie, it's Tom Sawyer. It's pretty much one of the most classic kid stories ever made. You're pretty much going to get what you think you're going to get. While the acting has aged well, certain other aspects of it haven't. I've mentioned before how during the early sound era, films weren't really capable of having background music. Now, while All Quiet on the Western Front actually benefited from this, that's not true of every movie, and this is actually a perfect case in point. While there doesn't need to be a wall of sound here, the film still feels like it could have used some music. Like, don't you want to hear some catchy, carefree theme song to transition us from scene to scene? Well, too bad, you don't get it. I'm not really blaming the filmmakers, it's just something that made it so that this movie hasn't really aged with grace. Also, some parts are a bit hard to follow, and the way that the main villain dies at the end is pretty unintentionally hilarious. Those issues aside though, this isn't a bad adaptation of Tom Sawyer. I don't think it's considered the definitive version of the story, but like I said, the kids are all very likable and the heart is still there. Which is a lot more than I was expecting going in, so you know what, kudos. The next movie on the docket is a film called On With The Show, which is another important piece of film history. I've been talking about groundbreakers in the audio medium lately, but this was a groundbreaker in the visual medium, in that this was the very first motion picture that was entirely shot in color. Sort of, kind of. Let me explain. Also, in case you're wondering why the clips I'm showing you are in black and white, that's because the color version of this film has actually been lost, leaving only a black and white copy. But it's still important to talk about, damn it! Now, while On With The Show was the first film to be completely shot in all natural color, this wouldn't have been the first time movie audiences had seen color on the big screen. The first usage of color in film actually goes all the way back to 1903 with a French short called Vie et Passion du Christ, or Life and Passion of Christ. Of course, short is a very loose word here since it was about 45 minutes long, but still not feature length, therefore it is a short. As you can see, we have come a very long way. From there, color had been used sporadically throughout movies for the next 20-something years. See, the thing about color is that it existed because of a certain way that you developed the film, and the solution you would have to develop it in was very expensive. The alternative was stenciling in color to the film negatives themselves, which is why Life and Passion of Christ looked like shit. So, because of these two extremes, movies would usually save color for documentary-esque films, such as With Our King and Queen Through India. This is considered closer to the first real color film, but in actuality, it's more of a series of short films documenting the King of England in, well, India. It's really not what you would call a full motion picture. In the rare case that color would show up in things that you would consider closer to an actual movie, like, a stylized story with a full 3-act structure and whatnot, they would use color sparingly due to how expensive it was, usually saving it for a big scene. So, like in the original Phantom of the Opera was mostly monochrome, but had color during the Masquerade Ball. Or in the Hollywood Review of 1929, where they saved it for the finale. On With The Show was the first feature-length movie to film using a process called Technicolor, which came the closest to looking like a modern color film, and they had it from beginning to end. So while this wouldn't have been a gigantic leap forward, it's still important in the same way that I guess you would consider Lights of New York important. It just proved that this could be done. Unfortunately, I'm having the same problem with On With the Show that I had with Lights of New York, and that the black and white print is incredibly hard to find, and the colored print is, like I said, lost. All that having been said, this actually wasn't nominated for anything, and honestly, reading the plot and watching the clips, this seems like the kind of film that I would absolutely despise if I had to watch the whole thing. Still, it was the first feature-length color movie, so you'd think it would deserve some kind of honorary award or something. But I digress. Another first that year that thankfully isn't lost, so I actually can talk about it, is Hallelujah. What makes Hallelujah significant? Well, this was the first movie with an entirely black cast. Not a single white person appears throughout the whole thing. To put this in perspective, think about how rare that is to see today. This came out in 1929, a time when, let's be honest here, being black in the United States kinda sucked. For reference, at this point in time, we're only 14 years away from when the highest grossing film was The Birth of a Nation, an incredibly racist movie showing the Ku Klux Klan as a band of heroes who saved the South from evil black people. Furthermore, we're only 1 year away from when that title was beaten out by The Jazz Singer, a movie that climaxes with a Jewish man wearing blackface. Also, there were the lynchings, those crazy Klansmen, the segregation, and the race riots. So, yeah. Making a movie with an all-black cast in this time period is pretty ballsy. Needless to say, the director, King Vidor, had one hell of a time actually getting this project off the ground. So much so that his producers actually required him to pay for the film out of his own pocket. But with all that being said, Hallelujah is actually a really solid film, and you probably don't even notice that there isn't any white people in the movie until it's almost over. The movie is essentially a slice of life tale about Zeke Johnson, played by Daniel Haynes, detailing his troubled relationships with his family, particularly his mother, played by Fanny Bell DeKnight, a family friend that he has a complex romance with named Rose, played by Victoria Spivey, and a seductive troublemaker he meets named Chick, played by Nina Mae McKinney. And that's really about the gist of it, telling Zeke's life through his ups and downs, the good times, the bad times, and everything in between. Mostly the bad times. Hallelujah is a great film for two reasons. First is the character of Zeke and how complex he is. He is very likable, and is sort of portrayed as an everyday kind of person like you and me, but the movie shows that an everyday kind of person like you and me can sometimes be a dick. He makes mistakes, sometimes very big ones, but you see his constant struggle between doing what is right and doing what he personally wants. And it's very realistic in that he doesn't always make the right choice. Hell, he actually almost never makes the right choice, but that makes for a much more compelling character. The other great thing about Hallelujah is the sense of community it has. Like, you always feel like you're part of this group and you know these people. Don't you feel like you could hang out in this dance hall, or you could be sleeping with these kids as your mother sings a lullaby? Please don't take that the wrong way. Or you could attend the sermon and be able to connect with any of the people here. The music and song sequences in this movie are not only catchy, but also a big leap forward for this point in time, especially once you remember that this came out only a few months after the Broadway melody. Now, while in the Broadway melody you can tell that a lot of the music was dubbed or not mixed well, here it never glitches. I'm assuming most of this movie was dubbed as well, but it's all totally in sync. I especially love the Shawnee Shuffle, which is sung by Chick during a scene inside of a local dance hall. Now, this is also very historically important, as it's one of the few accurate depictions of the Southern black dance halls, which was one of the birthplaces of classical jazz. Many other films coming out at the same time would usually exaggerate or whitewash these dance halls, so seeing a faithful rendition is wonderful. Although Hallelujah is a great movie, it has garnered some controversy in recent years, particularly from black historians who argue that the film wasn't as groundbreaking in black stereotypes as one would initially think. Now, speaking as a white man, I don't really know if it's my place to dictate what was and was not racist over 80 years ago, so I'm just going to acknowledge the complaints and how they pertain to the movie itself. To be precise, there seem to be three common criticisms that pop up. First is the fact that the only reason why this movie was considered a big deal is because it was made in the first place, which, yeah, that's actually a really good point. Another is that the movie reinforces negative stereotypes of Southern blacks, which this is one I'm honestly really curious about. When King Vidor set out to make this movie, he said that his goal was to make an accurate representation of the life of an average black male in the South after the Civil War. Especially coming off of some other films I've been watching from this time period, this movie actually feels a lot more real and unbiased. These don't feel like caricatures for the most part, they feel like real people. Most films stereotyping black people would show them as incompetent buffoons. Here they all feel more like real people. I mean, sure, there is a character who is a buffoon, but he's not meant to be indicative of the entire race. He's just an idiot on his own terms. I'm not seeing anything that racist in this film, but again, some others might see it, so this one might just fall to personal preference. The final big complaint I hear about Hallelujah is how the character of Chick stereotyped all black women as being, quote, money-grubbing whores, unquote, which, that strikes me as someone who is just looking for things to complain about. Like, granted, Chick is a money-grubbing whore, but if you watch the movie, you'll know that she's clearly not someone you're supposed to like or take after. In addition, Hallelujah has other females who are strong, likable characters, like the Mother and Rose. They're not money-grubbing whores. The only real gripe that I had with Hallelujah is that it does suffer a bit from happy ending syndrome, especially given all the shit that Zeke puts his family through during the course of the film. But still, he does pay some sort of dues for what he does, so I guess I can let it slide. It doesn't ruin the movie by any means. I don't really have an answer on whether or not the film is racist, so I think that's the sort of thing that'll depend on the viewer. At the very least, though, it's not distractingly racist, which is a lot more than I can say for a lot of other movies coming out from this time period. Watch it and decide for yourself, because all that aside, the movie is good. On to the next film. At the very tail end of the eligibility period was another significant movie called The Big House, which was one of the very first prison films, if not the first. I can't tell you whether or not it was the first because Wikipedia doesn't organize the category pages chronologically, so I'm just going to go ahead and assume that it's the first since it had tremendous influence on the genre. Anyway, The Big House opens with a young man named Kent, played by Robert Montgomery, who goes to jail for vehicular manslaughter. While you would think that the movie is about him trying to survive in prison, it actually revolves around his cellmates Morgan, played by Chester Morris, and Machine Gun Butch, played by Wallace Beery. From there, the rest of the movie is about their friendship and very quickly devolves into a male soap opera. As I said before, this was one of the very first prison movies and pretty much set the stage for all later prison movies. All of the cliches and tropes that you know started here. The evil warden, the corrupt guards, most major scenes taking place in the yard, the lunchroom riot, the crappy food, solitary confinement, the prison snitch, and the jailbreak. Really all that's missing is the shower room sodomy, and the allegory of how prison is a metaphor for your life and escaping it means being able to set yourself free. As you can probably tell, I'm not a big fan of this movie. This is one of those films that was probably a big deal when it first came out, but now it's very outdated. It's an interesting watch if you want to see where this genre began, but aside from that, it's boring. Really boring. That is, until you get to the ending. The climax of The Big House is one of the most unintentionally hilarious things I have ever watched. I don't think I'm spoiling too much when I say that the film culminates in an attempted prison escape that quickly goes to hell once the guards figure out what's going on. What then follows is one of the most overblown gunfights you'll ever see in your entire life. The thing lasts 15 minutes and only gets more insane as it goes on. More prison movies would benefit from having the warden call in the National Guard and marching tanks onto a cell block, in my opinion. And last, but not least, All Quiet on the Western Front's biggest competition that year was The Love Parade, which was nominated for a whopping 6 Oscars. Keep in mind, at this ceremony there were only 8 categories, so that's a pretty big number. Of course, it took home none of them at the end of the night, but still, it's the thought that counts. If The Broadway Melody was the first movie musical, then The Love Parade was the first modern movie musical. By that I mean there aren't song and dance numbers because their characters happen to work on Broadway, they just live in a world where they feel like they should sing and dance. In other words, they actually add to the story and tell us what the characters are feeling, being more what you would consider a musical. Of course, when I say that they add to the story, that's not really saying much since this movie's story is pretty damn silly. Count Alfred, played by Maurice Chevalier, is in trouble for his frequent womanizing and must report to Queen Louise I of Sylvania, played by Jeanette MacDonald. Sparks quickly fly between the two with sexual tension so thick that you could cut it with a knife, and the rest of the movie is then about their relationship with each other and all the ups and downs. Oh, and also their respective servants gossiping about them behind their backs and acting like a bunch of brain-dead chimps. And some very explicit sexual innuendos that could only have existed before the Hays Code. This movie is so old-school Hollywood, I freaking love it. If Hallelujah's musical numbers were impressive for the time that it came out, The Love Parade's musical numbers were a technological marvel for the time it came out. I mean, look at this! Look at how fast they're moving, how catchy the songs are, how elaborate the dancing is, how their lips are actually synced appropriately with what they're saying. And not just elaborate, it's also edited to give a sense of speed to it as well. In literally less than 1 year, we went from this...
they flicker there. A million hearts beat quicker there.
To this.
Don't forget she has a husband.
Don't forget she is the boss, and Her Majesty can't run him out of town.
The prince is right.
The queen is right.
The queen is right. That's enough from you.
Sit down.
That is incredible. Not only that, but I swear this might have been the first movie to have both dialogue and a soundtrack. You can actually hear music in the background of certain scenes. Do you know how wonderful that felt to my ears after watching all the rest of these films? And this came out before half of them. That is amazing! On the movie itself, at first glance it might seem like typical old school Hollywood schlock, but it is a bit better than you may initially think. The courting that our two main characters have only takes up the first half of the movie. The second half actually revolves around their relationship and the problems that pop up. Most movies, even now, usually just leave it at the couple falling in love and living happily ever after. But The Love Parade actually shows the troubles that a couple may go through, and honestly, it's a really good conflict. The way that it resolved itself at the end honestly surprised me. I'm not going to give it away, but let's just say that it's surprisingly mature, especially for a movie from this time period. The last thing to mention about The Love Parade is that this was a very important movie at the time, and may very well have been one of the most pivotal films in Hollywood history. And I'm not talking about the musical aspect of it. The Love Parade came out very shortly after the stock market crash of 1929, and its success actually recouped the losses that Paramount felt from the crash. Some speculate that this film is actually responsible for saving Paramount from going under. Considering how Paramount was one of the big studios in Hollywood at the time, that could have meant the whole industry may have gone under with it. The Love Parade may very well have single-handedly saved Hollywood from the Great Depression. Okay, but honestly, I'm moving away from the point of this video, that being to discuss whether or not All Quiet on the Western Front deserved the Oscar. And honestly, all of these movies just seem like things you find in their trivia sections on IMDb. First prison movie, first color film, first all-black film, you get the idea. When it comes to terms of quality, then All Quiet on the Western Front easily blows all of these films away. The only one that comes close is Hallelujah. Maybe Tom Sawyer and The Love Parade if we're being generous. This makes calling All Quiet on the Western Front the outstanding picture a success! Now, that's not to say that these movies are bad, it's just that All Quiet on the Western Front is definitely the best of the bunch. If you can only watch one of these films, which I don't know why you would, since you're just limiting yourself for no good reason at that point, but if you can only watch one of these films, make it that one.
I'll lay the dish here, ooh la 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 la, to hold the fish here, ooh la 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 la, the serviette's here, and now the cigarettes here, and matches too, they mustn't complain. A little candy, ooh la 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 la, a little brandy, ooh la 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 la, a bunch of roses to show the way we entertain, and a little bottle of champagne.
I'm going to be a clown in the circus when I grow up.
Oh, are you? That will be nice. Clowns are so lovely.
And when you're down here with me,
You float